But instead, it was as if he had been completely removed from her story. People close to him said he felt insulted, even mocked by how little space she gave him. A man who had played a central role in two of her most famous performances was now little more than a footnote. What made it worse in Garner's eyes was that the book was filled with warm memories of other co-stars. Rock Hudson, Cary Grant, even some lesser-known actors who had worked with her only once. Garner wasn't just left out. He was singled out by that very absence. It wasn't just what she failed to say, it was who she chose to talk about instead. Garner wasn't one to demand the spotlight, but he valued honesty. He believed stories should be told with all their misalliances, not just the parts that made someone look good in his eyes. Day's memoir was carefully controlled, shaped to preserve a public image that had little room for inconvenient truths. 2. She had taken control of the story, and she had done so by quietly erasing the parts that didn't fit her carefully drawn picture. In contrast, when Garner released his own autobiography years later, he included a chapter about his time working with Day. It wasn't bitter, but it was brutally honest. He described their chemistry on screen as real, but said their connection off-camera was strained, polite, and mostly professional. He wrote that he never truly understood her, and that something always felt just slightly off when they were alone together. There was no hatred, just unresolved tension that lingered like a question never answered. The stark difference between their two accounts only deepened the divide. While Day's fans celebrated her book, Garner's words landed like a quiet thunderclap, unexpected and unsettling. Some saw it as a final dig. Others saw it as a man finally telling the truth, after years of keeping up appearances. But to those who knew how he had carried that silence for decades, it was more than that. It was closure, delayed perhaps, but sincere. And for those who read between the lines, it was clear. Garner believed Doris Day had rewritten history and left him out of it. And once history was rewritten, there was no turning the page back in classic Hollywood. Silence often spoke louder than scandal. And in the case of James Garner and Doris Day, the silence from their mutual friends told its own story. Actors, producers, and directors who had worked with both stars rarely commented on their relationship. It wasn't just out of respect, it was because nobody wanted to get in the middle of something they didn't fully understand. Rock Hudson, one of Day's closest friends, stayed particularly quiet whenever Garner's name came up. Though he had worked with both stars and was often considered the bridge between their two worlds, he never offered insight into what went wrong. That silence only fueled speculation. Some believed Hudson knew more than he let on, especially about off-camera fights that never made it to the tabloids. Others in Day's circle followed suit. Directors who had worked on her films gave glowing quotes about her charm and warmth, but conveniently skipped over Garner when reminiscing. Meanwhile, Garner himself, known for being honest, chose restraint. That, in itself, was telling. He would speak his mind about nearly everyone else in Hollywood, but with Doris, his tone shifted. There was frustration, yes, but also something heavier, disappointment, maybe even sadness. Over time, rumors swirled. Some guessed that the tension between Garner and Day may have had personal roots beyond just a professional falling out, a failed romance, a secret argument, a broken promise. No one could say for certain, but those close to both stars admitted the energy between them was complicated. Even years after they had stopped working together, what added another layer to the mystery was the way Day continued to be celebrated. In Hollywood, she was honored repeatedly, praised as one of the last great icons of a bygone era. Garner never publicly objected, but sources said he bristled at how easily she seemed to escape criticism. She could charm the world, one friend of Garner's recalled, but that charm never worked on Jim again. In the court of public opinion, Day remained untouchable. Garner, meanwhile, carried the weight of an unresolved past that no one wanted to talk about. And while he never tried to tear her down, he also never let go of the feeling that something important between them had gone unspoken, and that silence would linger until the very end. As the decades passed, James Garner remained a respected figure in Hollywood, graceful in aging, quiet in retirement, and beloved by fans who remembered him as a leading man who never played by the rules. He largely stepped away from the spotlight, choosing to live out his later years privately, but at 85, In an interview that few expected and even fewer were prepared for, Garner finally addressed the one name that had shadowed his legacy for decades: Doris Day. The interview wasn't planned as a confession. It began as a look back, a review of a legendary career. But as the conversation turned to the golden era of romantic comedies, the interviewer mentioned Day almost casually. For a moment, Garner went quiet. Then, with a sigh, he said words that would shock even those closest to him. "I never truly forgave her." It wasn't said with anger. It was quiet, thoughtful, almost sad. Garner explained that forgiveness had never been about the injury on set or the canceled film, or even the erasure from her memoir. It was about something deeper, a betrayal of trust. She knew what she did, he said, and she never once owned up to it, not even a phone call, not a word. He admitted he had carried the resentment longer than he should have, that it had lingered not because of hatred, but because of disappointment. "We had a chance to be something great," he said, "not just on screen, but maybe even off it. But she closed that door, and I never got to ask why." The confession took the interviewer by surprise. This wasn't the typical Hollywood grudge, not the fiery feud tabloids loved to exaggerate. It was something colder, quieter, a wound that had never closed because the person who caused it had never acknowledged it existed. Garner's words stirred emotions among fans and fellow actors. Some defended Day, insisting she must have had her reasons. Others empathized with Garner's sense of abandonment, recognizing, in his words, a lifetime of holding back. But the confession was never meant to start a war. It was simply a man nearing the end of his life, telling the truth as he saw it. He ended the topic with a sentence that lingered in the air long after the interview ended. "Sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones you least expect." And by then, it was far too late for either of them to fix it. When Doris Day passed away in 2019, tributes poured in from all over the world. She was remembered as a bright star, a timeless voice, and a beacon of Hollywood's golden age. Her death brought a wave of nostalgia and respect. But for James Garner, who had passed just a few years earlier, it left behind an unfinished story that would never be resolved. Garner's confession, though quiet, had cast a new light on their legacy. Fans began to rewatch their films, searching for subtle signs of tension, wondering what had really happened behind those playful smiles and perfect comedic timing. But whatever had existed between them, hurt, misunderstanding, resentment, died with them. There would be no apology, no letter found, no last-minute reconciliation. The door was closed forever. In the years since, biographers and film historians have tried to piece together what went wrong. Some believe the rift was professional, rooted in clashing personalities and unspoken egos. Others think it was personal, maybe even romantic, something more vulnerable that neither star ever wanted to discuss publicly, but the truth remains hidden. Doris Day never addressed Garner's later comments. It's unclear whether she ever even heard them. She had grown famously private in her later years, rarely giving interviews and focusing mostly on her animal advocacy work. By the time Garner finally opened up, she had already faded from public life. If she had regrets, she never voiced them. And so, the mystery remains. Two of Hollywood's brightest stars, speculation, left behind a legacy as dazzling as it is incomplete. Their chemistry on screen was real. That much no one doubts. But the distance behind the curtain tells a more haunting story of missed chances, wounded pride, and a silence that spoke louder than any script. In the end, perhaps it wasn't about blame. Perhaps it was about two people shaped by an industry that demanded perfection, forced smiles, and silence in the face of pain. What they shared on screen brought joy to millions. But what they left unsaid tells a very different story, one that may never truly be understood. And maybe that's the most human part of all. James Garner and Doris Day, the untold story. You want to judge somebody. You want to find out whether they're cool or not. If they want something from you, they're going to be nice to you. When James Garner was 85 years old, he finally told a bitter truth he had kept secret for many years. It wasn't about being famous, money, or even Hollywood drama. It was about a woman the whole world loved, Doris Day, and what he said about her shocked even his best friends. In the early 1960s, James Garner and Doris Day were amazing together. On movie screens, like few other couples could be, people fell in love with their funny jokes, flirty conversations, and perfect chemistry in movies like The Thrill of It All and Move Over, Darling. They looked like the perfect couple for fun romantic comedies. Beautiful, charming, and totally in sync. But while the public loved watching them together, what really happened behind the cameras was much messier. Even while they were filming, some crew members whispered that things weren't as friendly between the two stars as the finished movies made it look. Garner was known for being easygoing, straightforward, and someone who didn't play Hollywood. Doris Day, on the other hand, was America's sweetheart. She had a carefully planned image that, according to Garner himself, didn't always match how she really acted when the cameras weren't rolling. They came from different parts of the movie business. Garner was the tough TV star who became a movie leading man, and Day was the sweet box office favorite that studios needed to be perfect all the time. Their first movie together, The Thrill of It All, made lots of money. But Garner would later hint that working with Day was anything but exciting. In interviews, years later, he would smile nicely when people asked about her, saying carefully chosen nice things. But his private diary told a totally different story. He wrote down moments on set that bothered him, and he often mentioned what he called Day's fake charm. One really telling diary entry from that time says, "She knows how to get what she wants, and she knows when to act innocent. That's the scary part." That one line shows a much more complicated picture than what Hollywood tried to sell in press tours and photo shoots. What's even more interesting is how often Garner wrote about Day in his diary. Like something about working with her had affected him way more than he wanted to admit. Studio bosses, always worried about what the public thought, pushed the idea that Garner and Day were close friends. They took pictures of them together when they weren't filming, created fake playful interviews, and used their chemistry to sell more movie tickets. For a while, it worked. But as years went by, Garner's silence about Day became more obvious. When other actors and directors talked about working with her, Garner's name was strangely missing from her stories. He rarely talked about her unless someone asked, and even then, his praise was short and weirdly cold. What exactly went wrong between them? Why did a man who got along with almost everyone in Hollywood become so distant when it came to Doris Day? According to people close to him, it all started with one day on the movie set. One single moment that would leave Garner feeling tricked and betrayed, and what happened during that moment would affect everything that came after. It was while they were filming Move Over, Darling that things took a dramatic turn. James Garner, always professional, insisted on doing most of his own dangerous stunts. He believed it made his acting more real and had built a reputation as someone willing to risk getting hurt for a good scene. But one particular scene pushed that reputation to its limits and showed something about Doris Day that he would never forget. The scene needed Garner to do a physical comedy bit involving a bathtub, a slippery floor, and a badly timed fall. On paper, it was typical romantic comedy slapstick. In reality, it was way more dangerous than anyone knew. During the filming, Garner slipped harder than planned and landed wrong, popping his shoulder out of place and tearing the muscles. The crew rushed over, cameras stopped rolling. The production stopped. But what stuck with Garner most wasn't the injury itself, it was how Doris Day reacted. According to many stories from the set, Day barely moved. She stood there distant and emotionless as crew members rushed around the hurt actor. Some said she turned away. Others said she just watched with a look that Garner would later describe as cold and uncaring. While no one could say for sure what she was thinking in that moment, Garner was shocked. He expected at least some sign of worry, a quick check to see if he was okay, something. But he said it never happened. Later in his autobiography, Garner remembered the moment very clearly. "I was lying on the floor in pain, unable to move my shoulder. And I remember looking up and seeing Doris just standing there. Nothing in her eyes, no worry, no reaction. That told me more than words ever could." That sentence, more than any tabloid, rumor, or gossip column, showed just how deeply he was hurt. In interviews years later, Day was asked about what happened. She brushed it off lightly, saying that Garner was a tough guy, and laughed it off like always. But Garner never laughed it off. He missed several days of filming and needed physical therapy for months after. The pain in his body eventually got better. But according to him, the hurt to his pride, and more importantly to how he saw Doris Day, never did. Some people on set claimed that Day was just overwhelmed, that she froze up in the moment. Others guessed she was frustrated with the long work hours and just wanted to get through the day. But Garner believed it was something else, something colder. He felt she saw the moment as annoying, not a crisis, and once he believed that, there was no going back. From that day on, their conversations were polite but guarded. Audiences believed in was carefully kept up for the cameras. But when the director yelled, "Cut," the distance between them was obvious. Garner, who had always been proud of being easy to work with, found himself pulling away. And while he never confronted her about it directly, he carried the memory of that silence for decades. It was a turning point not just in their work relationship, but in how Garner saw Day as a person. He never made a public scene, never went on a scandalous interview, but he would later say that the moment taught him exactly who she really was. And from then on, every decision he made around her would be influenced by that belief. After their first 2 movies together were successful, studios really wanted to put James Garner and Doris Day in another movie together. The public loved them. The box office numbers proved it, and their names together practically guaranteed a hit. But one highly anticipated movie would never get made. And what happened behind the scenes created a problem between them that never got fixed. Garner had already signed his contract, and production was moving forward when word came that Doris Day had suddenly dropped out. No warning, no explanation, just a quiet exit that left producers scrambling and Garner blindsided. He had reportedly pushed for Day to get the role, believing their past chemistry would make the film another success. Her sudden exit felt like more than a scheduling problem. It felt personal. People close to the production said that Garner was furious. He felt embarrassed, left hanging by someone he thought he could at least count on professionally. Worse, rumors spread that Day had made a private deal with another studio for a solo project that conflicted with the one Garner had committed to. Whether it was better money or an attempt to avoid working with him again, the result was the same. Garner was left holding the bag. What hurt most, he later admitted, was the silence. No phone call, no apology, no explanation. Just a quiet exit, as if the film and his involvement meant nothing at all. Friends said he took the move personally, seeing it as a clear message that Day no longer wanted anything to do with him. After that, Garner reportedly started turning down scripts that had her name attached. He didn't want to go through that again. For years, the public never knew any of this. The film was quietly canceled, and the press blamed it on creative differences. But, behind the scenes, the damage was real. Garner pulled away even more from any connection with Day, and while he stayed gracious in public, his private comments told a much different story. When asked decades later if he would ever work with her again, Garner's response was brief and blunt. Once was enough. It was a loaded answer from a man who rarely spoke in absolutes. And that quiet rejection marked the point of no return. In 1976, Doris Day released her autobiography, a glossy, best-selling memoir that painted her life in soft, pretty colors. Fans praised its charm and openness, and for many, it was the closest they ever got to knowing the real Doris. She shared stories of her childhood, her difficult marriages, and the pressures of fame. It was open in tone, but picky about what it included. And for James Garner, the book said more in what it left out than in what it revealed. In over 300 pages, Day mentioned Garner only briefly. Just a few nice lines about how wonderful he was to work with. No stories, no shared memories, no hint of their deeper connection or past problems. For someone who starred opposite her in 2 of her most successful films, leaving him out was striking, and to Garner, it felt like a deliberate erasure. Privately, he was furious. He had expected at least some recognition of the years they spent together on set, the good times, the bad times, and everything in between.